Welcome to Common Home TV. Today we're honored to have with us Father Patrick Kelly, S.J., Ph.D., a distinguished scholar and author whose work explores the intersection of faith, sports, and spirituality. In addition to his academic achievements, Father Kelly brings personal experience to his work, having served as captain of the Grand Valley State University football team, as well as having been all-conference free safety. We hope you enjoy this insightful conversation on faith, spirituality, and the common good. Father Patrick Kelly, welcome to Common Home TV.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Good to be with you.
Well, I guess the first question about all of this, as a priest, what's your involvement with sports? Like, how did you transfer from one to the other, and what's your background growing up with sports?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I loved to play sports. I realized that people enjoy different things, but that's something that I did all the time. A lot of different sports. And in high school, I played football and basketball, ran track a couple years, and played football in college. When I was in college, my faith life became important to me in a different way. I had been raised Catholic, but I wanted to learn more about my faith and grow in it. And after I was done playing football in college, there was a part of me that felt like I should put aside childish things, as St. Paul says. And I was thinking maybe that's what I should do with regard to sports. But in fact, that didn't work well for me. And actually, the spiritual exercises retreat, a 30-day retreat that I made as a Jesuit novice, was really important for me because we started off praying over how God has been present in the whole of our lives and all of our experiences. So it brought me back in touch with my experiences in youth, including experiences playing sports. And so there was that sense of being reconnected to that. And then as the retreat went on, it felt like there was also maybe a call to do ministry in this area, to walk with other people with respect to this area of culture. So rather than put aside childish things, I found myself more reflecting about, well, how was sports, a positive influence in my life in terms of my own personal development, my, things like making friends, things like that came to mind. Or on the other hand, how was sports maybe diminishing in my life, or maybe did I incorporate values that are contrary to the gospel, And so I started thinking about it more that way. And then I started studying these kind of things academically. I studied with the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the author of flow psychology theory. And I can talk a little more about his work. I think it's very rich for understanding sports. But the human experiences of sport, I realized over the course of my 20s and 30s, were actually influencing my attempts to live the Christian life. So I couldn't pretend like I had two separate lives that were unrelated to one another. The other thing, when I came to do my doctoral dissertation, I had to question, what would a Catholic take on sport as an aspect of culture be? And there hadn't really been much done at all on that question at that time. And so I looked at what Catholics did with respect to sports, how they participated in sports, especially later medieval, Renaissance, and then in later periods in the United States, then how that was related to how they understood the human person. Of course, how they understood the body, embodiment was an important part of that, but also surprisingly, how they understood what virtue is became important.
Well, I think it's important to also look at your work around the historical perspectives of the Catholic faith. And you wrote a book called Catholic Perspectives on Sports. So how did you, can you tell us a little bit about that book and a little bit about the Catholic involvement in sports to date?
Sure. Yeah. Well, actually, that book came out of my dissertation. So that question, what would a Catholic take on sport be, led to eventually to that book. I think maybe it's because the Olympics are going on right now. It might be good to remember that St. Paul plays an important role with regard to Catholic engagement with sport and attitudes to sports. He was the apostle to the Gentiles, as we know, and he was trying to take the good news, the gospel, to non-Jews, the Greeks. He was a Greek-speaking Jew himself before he converted. And so when he wrote his letter to the people in Corinth, for example, they had sponsored something called the Isthmian Games for 6 centuries, no, every other year. They were one of the pan-Hellenic games, the games that all the people in Greece participated in, like the Olympic Games. And you might recall he references sporting activities. All runners run a race, and so it's a run that you might win, and he talks about self-control and things like that. So he's using something that the people in Corinth were already very familiar with, and then he's referencing points of contact or similarity with the Christian life. By the way, I think it's important to point out that kind of metaphor or analogy will only work if there's actually some through line in between the experiences of participating in sports and the experiences of living the Christian life. There has to be some way to get from one to the other. Anyway, he with Paul, you have a biblical precedent, we can call it, of someone engaging with, dialoguing with sport as an aspect of culture. And so there's a lot more to say about this, but maybe for our purposes, in subsequent centuries, when other cultures were converting to Christianity, they had their own ball games in sports of various kinds. And so the mainstream approach of the church was to accept these, not to reject them, but to, we might say, baptize them by having them. Now they were played on the feast days and holy days of the church here. They become part of the life of the Catholic community, if you will. So Paul gets us started. I'd like to just say something, point to a couple areas that I think have relevance for our own time, that are, some aspects of the Catholic heritage. One of them would be the understanding of the human person as a unity, and this is related to the views of the material world, created world as good, if you think of Genesis chapter 1. And then the human person is the body is constitutive of what it means to be a human being. And St. Paul and others describe the human person as a unity, body, for our purpose, maybe we say body, mind, and spirit. Actually, that was one of the reasons that Montaigne, for example, when he wrote his essay on education, was making the case for including sport in the schools of the humanists during the Renaissance. He says, we're not raising a soul, we're not raising a body, we're raising a person. We must not split him into two. So the games and sports will be part of his training and formation, just like the studies will be. The second thing would be what I have come to call a play ethic. And Thomas Aquinas is very good on this. He asks in his Summa Theologica, can there be a virtue about games? And he answers yes, because virtue has to do with moderation. Here he's following the ancients, Aristotle and others. And so a life that is only about work or only about serious matters would be excessive. And a fully human life also needs time for play and recreation. So he also says at one point that there can be sin in a lack of play, because the person's being too serious all the time, or too, always thinking about work or something. So now he ends up saying that we play not for external goods. We do it because we enjoy it, for its own sake, he says. But the enjoyment that we experience while we're playing is directed to the good of the player. So it has this end in the human person. And we might think of it as, it has to do with experiencing life to the full, being fully alive. And a life that has work, study, and play, recreation is a full human life. I think you think of Irenaeus from the 2nd century, who said the glory of God is a human being fully alive. Maybe he's pointing to something like that. So Thomas Aquinas's views on this topic were the most influential view, it had the biggest influence on late medieval preaching about, games and sports on feast days. Should this be happening? Is this okay? Thomas's views were very important there. They also were foundational for the humanists during the Renaissance and the early Jesuits. They used the same way of thinking when they decided to include time for play and sport in the schools. In the case of the Jesuits, they had over close to 800 schools by the end of the 18th century. And so that made a big influence on education in the Western world. So I think these two themes, the unity of the human person and the play ethic, have some relevance for our own time, because certainly in the United States, and I think probably in many other places, especially in the Western world, there's a kind of still a hangover, a dualism, of body, mind, maybe spirit, and this way of approaching things would suggest that the embodied activities that we're engaged in sport, if I'm a unity, affect my consciousness. So I can actually have new insights in the context of playing sport, or make meaning, come to some understanding of who I am, for example, or can also affect me at the level of spirit, small letter S, which is what makes me capable of relationship with the Holy Spirit. That my embodied activities can affect me at these different dimensions of who I am. And by the way, that can be for good or for ill. So it's important to kind of pay attention to it. But the other thing is there's a tendency toward instrumentalization of sport, even of youth sport in our own context. So it becomes viewed as a means to an end. A lot of times it has to do with money, status, etc. And in this case, the play ethic would suggest, well, no, actually, it's in the activity itself. It has internal goods or intrinsic rewards. We do it for its own sake. That in the play itself, somehow something important is happening to the human person.
I really quite enjoy the idea of using the word play. And maybe when we speak a little bit about toxic sports culture, I mean, it's almost feels anathema, because you can have some versions of sports. I remember when I was a child, I was 6 years old, and I was going to my first provincial championship, and one of my best friend's father said, "You go out there and have fun today." And I looked at him, and I said, "Sir, fun has nothing to do with it." But that's a 6 year old, and that got taught somewhere. So it's really, I
Yeah.
think that's a really a powerful word. And I'd just like to continue a little bit further on about the Catholic, sports historically. What about structurally with the popes?
I actually think that what the popes have said, they're drawing on Catholic social teaching, and I think that it has something to contribute to our contemporary context. One of the main things is that the dignity of the person needs to be front and center when we're thinking about sport policies or practices. Persons created in the image and likeness of God. John Paul II, at one point at a gathering, he quoted the Sportsman's Manifesto, which said, "The person doesn't exist to serve sport, but sport should serve the human person in his or her integral development as a whole person." And then I think a couple other things that they tend to talk about quite a bit is, and especially at the times like this of the Olympic Games, how sport can be a context within which we learn how to be part of something larger than ourselves, especially team sports. So we can learn something about community, something about the common good. Pope Francis, of course, has emphasized a lot the culture of encounter, which he references when he speaks about sports, and especially about international competitions. That these can be contexts for encounter, dialogue across cultures, across religious traditions, and can help us to remember the unity of the human family.
Can you tell us some points of connection between sports and spirituality? Where's the intersectionality there?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm going to do this. This is just one way to do it. and I'm going to be drawing on the flow psychology theory of my mentor, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I like his research because it gives us access into the lived experience of play and sport. He studied other things as well, but play and sport was part of what he studied. And when he was asking people about moments in their life, that are most rewarding and most life is most meaningful, they described certain kinds of experiences, which he ended up calling flow experiences. And some of the elements of that are they center their attention on a limited stimulus field. So they're completely engaged in what it is they're doing. They're not distracted by any external concerns. And in fact, they're engaged in an activity that they enjoy. Their attention is so much taken up by what it is they're doing, they don't even have attention available to be explicitly thinking about themselves in the midst of it, like we often do in the course of ordinary life. People describe a sense of union with their surroundings. If they're climbing a mountain, it might be with the natural world. If I'm playing in a band, it might be with the other members of the band. I have a sense of, union, connection. In team sports, people often talk about a sense of union or bond with the teammates, as they're working together toward a shared goal. Some of the other things people describe is a kind of effortlessness, but this is preceded by discipline. So if you think of a girl basketball player who's right-handed, she has to learn how to shoot a left-handed layup. She has to first listen to what the coach says about what foot to jump off of, how her elbow should be situated, and then she has to practice it over time for long periods of time. But, by the end of her 8th grade year, she gets a pass and she can shoot that left-handed layup like she's been doing her whole life. So there's a kind of ease or effortlessness, but it's preceded by discipline. And then this kind of flow experiences are associated with growth. The person is moving from good to better. There's novelty or accomplishment. So in sports, their skills are increasing, but they're also growing, humanly speaking, more broadly. So now I find this research so rich because you might already be picking up on this. A lot of these elements of flow sound very similar to the way spiritual writers describe the dynamics of the spiritual life. And I've noticed, for example, that there are similarities between what I've just described and the way Ignatius of Loyola describes spiritual consolation. So this has to do with genuine happiness and spiritual joy, for example. He says it's a kind of effortlessness or ease to it. He says it experience the spiritual consolation of God's presence in one's life, going from good to better. It's like coming into your own house through an open door. Or it's like gentle and easy, like a drop of water falling into a sponge. And these moments are important to pay attention to. But for Ignatius, those things are experienced, they're preceded by a disciplined life, the spiritual exercises where you do prayer and reflection and, come to know who the person of Jesus is. And then over time, a person develops a kind of sensitivity, and there's this kind of flow to their life and sense of God's presence. And a spiritual consolation also is associated with going from good to better in our lives, in our spiritual lives. It's a kind of reassuring step forward, is the way one Jesuit put it. So now I'm just I think your listeners might also be interested in other religious traditions.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
So in my classes, we study other spiritual traditions while the students are also reading about flow psychology theory. We read Phil Jackson, the professional basketball coach, wrote a book called Sacred Hoops, where he writes about teaching the players how to meditate. So that kind of meditation helps them to slow down their mind and distraction and be in the present moment, center their attention on what they're doing, etc. And then the Chinese notion of wu wei, which is kind of effortless action. It means literally non-doing, but it's a kind of spontaneous, effortless, unself-conscious action in the world. that's fruitful and effective. That also has interesting, kind of similarities to the flow experience. And so we, in the classes, we use the account of human experiences, including in play and sport, that flow gives us, and then we bring it into dialogue with different spiritual traditions. With regard to personal growth in sport, or how it might open out and connect to spirituality, another thing to say, and this is something that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi emphasizes, he's actually influenced in this respect by Teilhard de Chardin, and that is that in team sports, especially, what happens is that the young person learns how to bring his own skills, and to coach and others help him or her to develop those, his personality, who he is, to the team, so that he or she can work harmoniously with the other young people that they're playing with as they pursue a common goal together. And Csikszentmihalyi refers to this as differentiation, that is to say, my unique skills and capacities, and integration as they're connected to, and I work harmoniously with others, toward a common. And he says that this is how, when both of these things are happening at the same time, differentiation and integration, this is how teams, institutions, societies grow or evolve. So he would suggest that there's something very rich going on when both of those things are happening at the same time.
Now, all this stuff has sounded great about spirituality and the benefits of sports, but I'd like to turn our attention to a little bit about toxic sports culture. Having grown up in North America and played what the Aussies would call gridiron sports, I look back at a lot of the things that have happened on that field with respect, especially to coaches, but as well as what was allowed to happen in locker rooms and locker room banter. That's not being finicky about stuff like that, but there were some things where I look back at older people in power and how they exerted it onto young impressionable people that I look back now and I go, that wasn't a good thing. So how do we push back positively, a positive influence into toxic culture to combat it, but at the same time, not calling for us to not compete to our full,
Right.
And especially in aggressive sports, right? Like there are aggressive sports that I absolutely love. The idea of playing football or ice hockey or watching the Aussie rules, my kids playing lacrosse and Aussie rules. The thing about toxic culture isn't how to make it maybe less competitive or less aggressive, but within that rubric, there has to be a way to get rid of some of the more toxic traits that I'm sure you've encountered throughout your career as well.
Yeah, as I'm hearing you speak, I'm thinking of that insistence on the dignity of the person, and that means especially when it comes to young people, and you have young people in your charge, or you're caring for them, and that they already have value. I mean, I don't know what, in terms of the examples that you're thinking of, if the dynamic might be a lot of emphasis on productivity or winning, and that can lead to some of the things that are going on. So there's a basketball coach, used to coach at the University of Michigan, named John Beeline. He went to Jesuit schools himself, and he talked to the Jesuit Friends and alumni recently, and he said the athlete is inside the person. You have to get to know the person. And if you think you're going to inspire, a young person to be their best, and you have to know them, and you have to respect them, and start from there, and then you can reach the player, and try to encourage it. And also I think it just makes a lot of sense. We're all, we've been in a lot of different kind of situations in life, when we know that the people who we're reporting to, or who we're working for or playing for, actually do care about us as human beings, it tends to lead to better, more motivation to work hard, etc. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, the other thing, just to say, I noticed Katie Ledecky. I know she's swimming against some Australian swimmers, and they've beaten her in some early races. But she just recently won the 1500 meter, and which is her race. But I saw interviews with her, and she was emphasizing joy. She always loved swimming. She said even without the competition, she would be in the pool all the time. And it's always given her joy. And I think that's something really worth paying attention to and thinking about. People who achieve at the highest levels, if you think about people even in the workplace, in academia, in other contexts, they're people who really enjoy what they're doing. That's why they spend so much more time, and they go beyond what everybody else, the minimal requirements of their workplace or their profession. They put the whole of themselves into it, and it actually ends up in them being more productive. So I think that when it comes to youth sport, it might be worth reflecting on that, and maybe for parents to have conversations with their kids that also check in about, are you enjoying this, this sport, or are there others, are there other sports you enjoy, or so anyway, that
Yes, it seems that seems like a really good antidote to toxic sports culture is getting those people who are in positions of power to really understand that the power of instilling the joy into the person also has as the added benefit of the joy brings more practice, the joy brings more practice, the practice brings more discipline, the discipline brings more flow brings more success on the field or on the ice or wherever it may be.
And coaches too can coach in such a way that practice is enjoyable. So for Csikszentmihalyi High, activities that tend to be conducive to flow are challenging activities that require skills. And so, and when the challenges and the skill level are about the same, that's when the activity is enjoyable. If you think of a game of ping pong, when I was a boy, we had a ping pong table in our basement. And the most enjoyable ping pong games were when the volley was the longest. And that's because each of us was pushing the other one at the very edge of their skill level. And there was something exhilarating about that, no? So the challenges that I was presenting my 10-year-old companion with were about at his skill level, or a little bit higher or lower. And the same thing with me. And so we kept pushing each other at the edge of our skill level. And it was, we were both also getting better at ping pong. And so a coach can structure practice so that the players have an opportunity to have challenges that are at or about or above their skill level, so that it's both enjoyable and they're getting better as a team. So I think that's a very rich kind of insight also that comes from the flow psychology theory.
I've seen that in real life as well. I think some of the, just from my own personal experience, I remember very vividly at like 14 years old playing the LaSalle Warriors, and this middle linebacker and I went at it. And oh my gosh, every time I knew I was getting blindsided, I knew where I got to get that number. And the whole time it was just such a battle. And I remember in the handshake line at the end, we both looked at each other like, "Thank you." And I felt like that's one of those things
Well,
that you'll remember forever, because it was like I was
yeah.
really trying to blow you up there, like every time. And I know you're doing the same. But then when the helmets were off, that handshake line, all that aggression melted, and it was all just like, thanks for pushing me. And I think that's exactly right. How to get those things together, but also how not to then diminish those who don't have the genetics or capabilities, or to
Right,
put down. And sure, there has to be a strata, but to understand the dignity of the person lies, no matter how good you are at sports, is not going to, in the eyes of God,
right,
in the eyes of God, doesn't make you more or less. You don't become more or less out of that.
right.
So speaking about health and well-being, back to the sort of the individual, can you discuss the relationship between physical health and mental health, and spiritual well-being in the context of sports and athletics?
Yes, and there's a great deal of emphasis on, mental health in sport, even at the elite levels in recent years, which I think is a positive development, because we're being reminded that this is a human being, a human person, and sometimes, especially when at the highest levels, when there's so much emphasis on performance, and we can, and it has all this significance socially, in the media, etc. We can lose touch with that important fact. So, I'm reminded of what John Paul II says: the person's more important than sport. The person doesn't exist to serve sport. Sport should serve the human person in their own, development as a whole person. So, and sometimes athletes, elite athletes, there's a swimmer from Caleb Dressel from the United States, actually have to step back from their participation. For him, it had to do with kind of perfectionism and critical mentality. So even when he came home from the last Olympics, even though he had won several medals, including gold medals, he wasn't happy because he kept, being critical with himself. And so he was losing the joy and had to actually step away from his sport
And
for some
a
time.
fellow Catholic, Simone Biles, as well. She stepped away from mental health.
Simone Biles
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
same, a similar thing, and her story is more has other complexities and dimensions to it, having to do with her own training and the abuse that went on in women's gymnastics in
Mm.
the United States. So it's interesting how these athletes talk about, to connect to what we were just talking about a moment ago, they talk about needing to find the joy again in their sport, and reconnecting with that. Phil Jackson is the most successful professional coach in the United States in any sport we've had, and he says that the main job of a coach at that level, and he was coaching Michael Jordan, and Kobe Bryant, is to reconnect players with the love of the game. And that's what he did during practices, and so that's telling, for those who might say, well, having it be fun or enjoyable, what's that have to do with, winning? And
Mm.
well, there's an indication that it might have a lot to do with it. So anyway, some athletes I'm noticing, when they step away or they take a break, for some of them, it's helpful just to be reminded that they're, loved as they are by being around family and other people. Some athletes take up meditation, and then others, they'll kind of come to a deeper faith in God and kind of a realization, of that they're loved by God just as they are already, kind of that, created in the image and likeness of God. And for some of them, it's being surrounded by a community of faith that shares those same, convictions, and where there's support for one another can lead to a new kind of freedom, and allow them to enter into their competitions with a kind of, Ignatius of Loyola has this word indifference, or interior freedom. It has to do with I'm going to passionately give myself to something, but Yeah, I'm going to have a stance of interior freedom with regard to the outcome. I don't control, well, I don't control the outcome. And yet I'm really passionately giving of myself, everything of myself to something. Um, and I think athletes that do that, that actually can also help performance because you're not afraid of losing. You're not focused only on the outcome. You can be in the present moment. The best coaches focus on that kind of thing. You know, what
You
college
can see
football
that
coach.
more and more. The podcasts I listen to, it's a bunch of people, middle-aged guys talking. Every time they talk, they're amazed speaking with coaches, and you can't just yell at them anymore. And the coaches are responding like, "Yeah, that doesn't work." It's speaking exactly to your point. And ice hockey, a game that's just chirp, 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 fight, hit. Yeah, you can do all that, but you're not drawing the best out of your person by being Iron Mike Keene, to make a hockey analogy, or just somebody that's going to be bullish. And that doesn't work on this generation. And perhaps that's a really actually positive thing for sports moving forward, I think. And
Yeah,
and we were just speaking about the Olympic Games, so I'd like to pivot back to that a little bit because we'd be remiss not to take advantage of these Olympic Games. I got to say, as an Australian, the Summer Olympics, now that I'm a dual citizen, as an Australian, way funner to watch Summer Olympics. Way funner to watch Olympics now because it's they have a great sports culture out here. And I'd like to know
yeah,
about any church historical ties to the Olympics.
yeah, yeah. And I heard today. I think Australia has 18 gold medals. I think it's
Yeah, not
maybe
a big deal.
highest that they've had. Or um,
Mm.
um, yeah. So actually, Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, went to a Jesuit school, high school in Paris, Saint Ignace. Um, and I might have alluded to earlier that, in the early history, the Jesuits had made time and had space for play and sport in their schools, and that had a big influence on education in the Western world. But Pierre de Coubertin went to a Jesuit school, in the later 19th century, and the Jesuits had been restored after they were suppressed, and they were restored by a papacy that was under siege, and so they became, kind of allied with the monarchy in France, a conservative kind of thing. So anyway, he complains that that they were studying all day, even though they had a gymnasium and they had other things, but that they were studying a late. So the Jesuits kind of lost touch with their earlier traditions and spirituality, frankly, during that period. And they had the students, according to de Coubertin, studying all the time. A lot of emphasis on authority and obedience. And so he was not impressed. And in fact, he was much more influenced. Okay, the Jesuits did introduce him to the Greeks. So he studied, the Greek classics in Greek. Um, but otherwise, like I said, not enough sports. But he was really inspired by his trip to England and the English schools and their love of sport. And you might have heard about muscular Christianity in England at that time and later. So that was more of an influence on him. He met with Pope Pius X in 1905, and Pius X, soon after that, had gymnastic competitions in St. Peter's Square, and he made a speech where he was affirming the value of games and sports. So that was an early kind of point of connection. And then every 4 years, in more recent history, the popes will put out a letter or make some kind of statement about sports, and they usually touch on the kind of things that we talked about earlier: sports and the common good, culture of encounter, opportunity for dialogue, and the unity of the human family. I've been touched by that. There's a lot of graciousness at these Olympics on the part of athletes. A lot of athletes who don't make it to the podium, I see them congratulating their competitors who do. For example, there was a very moving moment when Simone Biles and Jordan Childs from the United States, who were the silver medalist and the bronze medalist, bowed down before Rebecca Andrade of Brazil when she won the gold medal. And I thought that was quite impressive, especially when seeing in different parts of the world, there's an inability to lose, except losing in other domains, like in elections, for example. There's a reminder, I think, in the case of these gymnasts, that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. That there's a common, shared good, and that's the sport and excellence in our sport. And it's having value or meaning isn't dependent on my being number one all the time. It still has value and meaning, and I'm part of it, part of something bigger than me. Anyway, I think we need to get that kind of sense of being part of something larger than ourselves in other domains of life as well, a sense of the common good. Simone Biles, the Catholic, her generosity and her magnanimity, when she lost a thing, an event, individual event that she'd been training for and dreaming of winning her whole life. Or another young Catholic woman, Katie Ledecky, could she teach us something when she reminds us of the importance of joy in sports and in life in general? I think also Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone. I'm sorry, I'm mentioning all American athletes here. That's who NBC is covering. But she went to a Catholic high school. She's a 400-meter hurdler. She went to a Catholic high school and is a Christian woman, but she speaks often and very movingly about the importance of being rooted in God, and that this is her identity, being a daughter of God. So there might be so much to learn, to let our hearts be touched by what we're seeing and what's happening in the body. I think for much of the modern period, if we heard that the church had something to say about the body, we would be justified in thinking that it probably had something to do with sexual morality. But recently, and dramatically so after Vatican II, I think the popes and the church have been paying attention to the body in a broader way, which includes now the world of sport. This is an important development because sports are a human universal. They're found in all cultures at all times. They're pervasive today. I had one other thing that I wanted to mention, maybe, that
Sure.
When Pope Francis was at the General Congregation to elect a new pope, he spoke about he thought of this image of Jesus knocking on the door from the book of Revelation. And he said he thought about it a little differently. He thought of Jesus standing inside the church, knocking on the door, wanting to get outside the church walls so that he could be with people where they're actually living and experiencing life and stuff. And I think maybe the church's attempt to engage with the world of sport would be an instance of this in our time.
Well, this might be foreign to some other. We are Commonwealth TV's global, so it might be foreign to some other countries. But being from North America, I know the American context very well. I it's a proud day where I get to wear my Notre Dame. I'm a fanatic, as you can see. I put the play as champion, play like a champion today in the background. In fact, the provincial of the Redemptorists in Denver province. I haven't seen him in years, and within 5 minutes we were talking about Hook'em Horns versus Notre Dame. So it's the Catholic universities. It's a
Right.
big deal, and I just like to talk a little bit about Catholic universities leveraging their rich cultural heritage to foster a deeper dialogue with relationships of sports, education, especially in the context of social justice, and community engagement. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, and this is an important topic now in the United States because I don't know how much you're aware, but the landscape has shifted dramatically just in the past few years with regard to intercollegiate athletics. And so maybe it won't we won't have time to go over all of that, but just to say, generally speaking, a lot of money has come into intercollegiate athletics, and it's associated with, when they started televising sports and the creation of a network called ESPN. And so a lot of money comes into, the NCAA and schools and conferences. But the young people that play, there's a limit on what they can receive as far as just college, academic, scholarship in the sense of what covers those needs for their academic life. And so that's now all unraveling and changing. And the big question has been, and it's a justice question in a sense, who has the right to access all of that money that has come in? Coaches' salaries at the highest levels are really exorbitant. And for example, and the schools are building, there's a kind of arms race to build stadiums and facilities and things like that. So who has the right? And do the young people that play, who are the attraction, what extent do they have the right? So valid issue question. But I think what's left out when that's kind of only the focus or the main focus is a question like, what is the human and cultural significance of sport anyway? And you need to answer that, have some kind of answer to that question to be able to say how sport is related to education. And if you don't have an answer to that question, if you're not able to articulate how it's related to education, then it's more vulnerable to being regarded merely as a means to ends, money, the schools getting more applications because they're playing on national television or they've had a successful season. But that's a very small step from there to regarding student athletes themselves as means to ends, to an end as well. So instrumentally. So anyway, I think that a Catholic university where there's an emphasis on the humanities, an emphasis on, philosophy, even studying philosophy and ethics, can help us to kind of have a deeper reflection and dialogue that would include questions like this. What is sport anyway? And then how is it related to education? The other thing that's left out, if the only question is who has access to the money, is the possibility that such a narrow focus or a focus only on money, we don't recognize that actually that can corrupt sport itself or higher education. Just one example, the conferences have reorganized in the United States. And it was all driven by money associated with football that comes from television, companies. And so schools saw they could get bigger contracts in other conferences, and so they joined. But that meant that the conferences extend from coast to coast. But nobody seems to have thought about the young people that play non-revenue producing sports where they play in the middle of the week, And what would this mean for their education if they have to travel, such distances, for example? And it wasn't until student athletes actually started speaking out about this that people started making gestures toward it. We still don't know what's going to happen. But that's an example of corruption. If money is the only thing driving things, that education itself in this case can become corrupted. The other thing is that external goods come to individuals. So money, in this case, comes to individual persons or individual institutions. And what can happen is that that leads to a kind of individualism that's in the culture more generally in recent decades, starts to, infiltrate sport. And so sports becomes all about me and, what's best for me. Kids can transfer now from one university to another without having to sit out, and they can transfer more than once. And they can also get money for their name, image, and likeness. And so they're going, from one school to the other, you know, some of what we were talking about earlier about maybe sport has to do with learning how to be part of something larger than yourself. That kind of dimension of it is potentially getting lost.
Well, we've taken up a lot of your time, so I just have one final quick question. Transcendent moment. Can you share with us a time where you played or witnessed sport, where you felt that transcendent experience? Now, I'm not going to try to even pronounce, let alone spell the name of your mentor that kind of like before this interview started, you know, taught me so much about that, you know, linking in that transcendence and the psychological modeling of like why we feel and how that can connect to spirituality. But is there anything in your playing career or that you've witnessed where you just, I'm in that moment totally in the presence?
Well, I experienced flow a lot when I was playing sports. So, you know, in a way, even just throwing a rubber ball against the wall and catching it with my glove, or shooting baskets down at the schoolyard, is almost kind of akin to meditative, you know, meditation type experience for me. Because it was a kind of, you know, centering of your attention, um, and yeah, there's a joy in it for me. I loved running with the football in high school. I was a tailback, and so yeah, my favorite play would be a sweep around, you know, pitch the ball to you, and you run around either right or left side. There's a lot of creativity in that, a lot of joy in it, and I guess I would call it a sense, was certainly flow. Now, but I would say though, for me, as far as the experiences playing as a young person, and even think about young people today, the more significant experiences really, I broke my ankle right before my senior year of high school, so I couldn't play at all. And we had one of the best teams in the state that year. And the night before our first game against our arch rival, all of the guys on my team came over to my house. You know, and I, even as I speak about that now, I have goosebumps. You know, it's kind of a talk about self-transcendence, you know, or being a part of something larger than yourself. That's that that experience for me has a kind of spiritual meaning to it still, you know, and dimension to it. Those same guys, a lot of those same guys that were there at my ordination, you know, many years later, and came to my first mass.
We'd like to thank Patrick for his time today. This video is also available in podcast format, which you can find on the Common Home TV website. Common Home TV podcast, Questions for the Modern World, is available wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you take the time to subscribe.